I was thinking as Alice was talking that the day after the election, I was on a panel in Princeton by the African American Studies Department. It was one of the most amazing panels I had been on. The room was absolutely packed. It was this size. It was an overflow room. Cornel West was on the panel, so they were there to see him. But you know, the emotion in the room was something I had never seen, certainly at an academic panel. There were tears in the audience. People were on the edge of their seats. And the level of excitement was hard to capture if you weren't there. A year later, I think most panels, even with Cornel West, on President Obama are a lot different. The enthusiasm is not quite as high as it was. The passion is not there. There are tears in the room, but for different reasons than there were on that day. And I remember at that panel, I whispered at this. I'm always the cynic on the panel. It's my role, I guess, studying Congress. But I whispered to Cornel West that if this administration can't contain these expectations, they're going to have a big political problem within a year. And I think that's part of what's happened. It certainly happened, I think, with national security, which I'm going to talk about today. When President Obama started his campaign in Springfield, Illinois, he made from the start national security a central issue in terms of what distinguished him from President Clinton and ultimately what he wanted to change from the previous administration. He called the war in Iraq a tragic mistake, reminded his supporters many times that he opposed the intervention from the start. While he did embrace the argument that the right war had been Afghanistan and that was an area there needed to be a more aggressive approach, he also criticized many other aspects of the war on terrorism, violation of civil liberties, use of executive power and secrecy, circumventing the legislative branch, and more. Like President John F. Kennedy in 1960, and then Johnson, he came into office after a time that Democrats had really been beat up on national security issues. When Kennedy and Johnson were presidents, the questions of who lost China and stalemate in Korea really damaged the advantage that Democrats had built during World War II on this issue. And I think there is a similarity in terms of the period in which President Obama stepped in. A year later, I think it's fair to say that President Obama has not overturned much of the war on terrorism. There have been certain important changes, greater emphasis on multilateralism and trying to deal with these issues, at least initially, more emphasis on the potential of diplomacy and an announcement, at least, of no torture, which I guess you should always listen to with some skepticism until we know what's really going on. He has called for the trial of the 9/11 perpetrator in the civilian court, and those are not insignificant announcements. But Jack Goldsmith, who was one of the leading critics of the Bush administration, who was part of the administration and left, and wrote a book about what was going wrong in his mind. He wrote an interesting article in the New Republic where he took on Richard Cheney, and he said that Vice President Cheney's attacks on Obama were unfair and wrong, but not for the reasons you might think, because in fact President Obama had kept much of the war on terrorism in place. That the change was not as huge as the Republicans were making it to be. And a lot of the attacks were off the mark because much of the system was still very much in place. Guantanamo has now emerged symbolically as kind of the test of where the president will go. Instantly announced the closure of Guantanamo, backed off when he got political resistance. Now again, it seems to be in limbo, especially after the events over the Christmas and New Year break. In Iraq, the president has continued with the withdrawal plan, but that was a plan that was already put into place by the Bush administration. So it's not clear that's a dramatic shift at all. And in Afghanistan, he has now called for an escalation of the operation there. And I think, at best, that is filling out part of President Bush's war on terrorism rather than reversing it. So what has changed? What explains the limits of the changes that we have seen? And instead of what we had written a year ago, I'm going to talk about that. But when when you're doing current events, you can do that, I think. What happened? First, I think, is the obvious, the economy. So, guy comes into office, war in Iraq, national security were his calling cards, but I think clearly the economy has overwhelmed everything else. The president invested a lot of his early months in the stimulus program and then decided to use a lot of his capital on health care. So that's kind of the, I think, first obvious one. National security took a backseat until recently. Second stems from the politics of national security. Really, despite the president himself saying he saw a huge difference with the history of Lyndon Johnson going into Vietnam, I think any historian listening to the tapes of 1964 and 1965 and who studied the period can't ignore some of the similarities. Not just in terms of kind of going in against the wishes of advisors or suggestions, but in the politics. Johnson's fears of the Republican right were quite striking in 1964. It played a big role in his dismissal of proposals from everyone from Richard Russell to Hubert Humphrey, who were saying Vietnam was not a good idea. Vietnam was not worth that much to the United States. Vietnam was not really worth it if we won. But Johnson came of age in the 1950s. He was a Democratic leader who had cut his teeth in a period when, again, Republicans had really undermined Democratic strength through the anti-communism, who lost China, stalemate in Korea issues, that in 1952 brought Republicans control of both the White House and Congress. And I think right now, some of the fears about taking bold steps on any issue, from civil liberties to other parts of the war on terrorism, are always in the context of hearing Richard Cheney on Politico, or reading him on Politico, or listening to him on TV, and listening to the kind of constant refrain from Republicans about the Democrats being weak on defense. And I do think that has constrained the administration, and now it will be that much harder. Going into 2010, first with the midterm elections, and then B, after the Christmas bombing effort and the bombing in Afghanistan of CIA operatives, I think the president politically is in an even weaker position to take the kind of steps many of his supporters certainly would have hoped for. So I think he should actually kind of look back to that 1960s period and see the kind of mistakes that can happen when politics simply overwhelms policy decisions. Second problem that he's faced is something that is conventional wisdom in history, political science. Institutions are hard to change. And so, the excitement of the campaign is great, and people had, very high hopes of really reversing things in Washington and changing the status quo. But all of us who study politics know the number of times that really happens is limited. Not just building the kind of programs you saw in the 1930s with public works that Jason so well captured, but then dismantling institutions is a whole other problem. There's a great study by a political scientist, Paul Pierce,